Okay, this is probably a good time to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PACICC, and I'm the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I'm also your moderator for this afternoon. A welcome to everybody, and a special welcome to any first-timers joining us here today. This is our final Risk Officers Forum meeting of the year. In this continuing nightmare of COVID, we find ourselves in an online world, and that will continue on indefinitely until perhaps a vaccine is found. It's a great opportunity for us to connect with parties across Canada, so welcome. We have reps joining us here today from approximately 60 organizations across the country. A very exciting agenda. I want to first give a shout out to Danica Hall, my colleague and operations manager. She's going to be working behind the scenes, advancing all the slides in today's presentations. So thanks for doing that, Danica. Could I ask you please then to advance to the next slide, and we'll look at the agenda for today. So I'm going to begin with some housekeeping items, and then we're going to talk about our speakers. There's been a change in the order, and I will talk to you about that. Upcoming events for 2021, and then finally I'll talk to you about a satisfaction survey that will, as usual, accompany the end of this broadcast. So the housekeeping items. We are on the MS Teams platform, and let's just go over some ground rules to make this a productive meeting for everybody. Thank you for muting yourself and for disabling your video. This will eliminate background noises and also enhance your signal strength to make for a better broadcast. You'll know if you've used Teams before, the taskbar, there is an icon for a hand up. If you have a question or a comment to pose to our speakers, we'd ask you to please click that. You'll be advanced to the front of the line, and then we'll draw from you. We'll ask you to unmute yourself. I'll call upon you to ask your question or pose your comment, and then mute yourself, and we'll hear back from the speaker. We want to make this very conversational, so we certainly encourage your questions, your comments at any time during the broadcast, during the presentations, and I've talked to our speakers about that. We'll talk about antitrust compliance here, like we usually do, and we're obligated to in a very competitive industry like we're in. The Competition Act remains in force. There's to be no collusion, no chatting about approaches to business strategies, the claims adjusting practices, scopes of coverage, resolution of mixed claims, and or management of third-party vendors and service providers. You're going to notice that the meeting is being recorded. We're doing this only for the first two sessions. So we're going for our keynote speaker and for our presenter on the shortage of HR talent in our industry. We're going to record those two sessions and post those on our website. We're not recording the third session, in which we have an industry panel talking about the risk management seminar that took place this morning with OSFI, and there were 9 different agenda items that they're going to walk through with you. And so we encourage idea sharing and questions, comments, your opinions. It just helps gain a better understanding of what was discussed this morning across the industry. And there are no media and no regulators joining us here now. It's by invitation only. You're being led into the lobby, so it's a secure meeting, but again, operating under the Competition Act. So a copy of this broadcast will be posted on our website very shortly afterwards, and so you'll be able to see that, and it's of interest to people that couldn't join us here today for on-demand rebroadcast in future. So you'll notice in the agenda we've had a change in our keynote speaker. David McNaughton is not able to join us. Just an issue came up very quickly this week, a very unavoidable situation, and so we apologize for that. David is unable to be present here today to walk through his presentation with you, but we hope to have him back at some point in the near future to talk about high-level risks facing Canada. And for the record, I'm obligated to say, no, David is not in Pennsylvania counting ballots, although that is that's going on. Okay. Losing a keynote speaker immediately before an event can be a very stressful situation. If you're a fan of politics or sport, you're going to see what we are going to execute here, and that is called a nice pivot. We have our PACICC President and CEO, Alistair Campbell, who has been called in, and he's going to give an overview of the consultation survey of members that took place this summer. And he's appeared on past broadcasts, as you know, very well known in the industry, and he's going to update you on priority issues for our organization. After Alistair speaks, we're going to hear from Jeff Shields from Strategic Resource Consultants, and he's going to be talking about talent risk in the industry. And then we're going to hear from our industry panel, Michelle Falcons from Heartland Farm Mutual Inc., Tracy Mann from Economical Insurance, and Chris Walton from Gen Re. are joining us for that panel discussion. They're going to lead the discussion, but they are just facilitators. They're not presenting per se. They're just generating questions, comments, ideas, and trying to keep an open conversation from everybody online. We have a large pool of people here joining us today, so it'll make for a very interesting conversation. So as I said, Alistair is going to be talking about the #1 priority issue for us this year, and that is expanding PACICC's resolution toolkit. This concerns the enhancement of resolution powers of PACICC. We are the resolution authority for Canada's P&C insurance industry, and we had requested member input over the summer with a consultation paper, a very comprehensive paper prepared by my colleague Grant Kelly, on options to provide PACICC with greater flexibility to deal with future insolvencies. So it should be a very, very interesting talk. I know that many of you today were actively involved in framing survey responses for your organizations, and we thank you for that. So with that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Alistair and hand the microphone over to him. And if you have questions as Alistair goes through his presentation, just put your hand up, use that icon to put your hand up. I'll call upon you, and then Alistair can answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I hope you can hear me clearly. And thanks, everyone, for joining on a Friday afternoon. Happy Friday. I think many of us probably feel like we've earned this one. It has been a very interesting week, and it would have been fantastic to hear former Ambassador David McNaughton, who spent some very important years down in Washington, D.C., doing his very best as a level-headed Canadian to decode the American political environment and understand how to move from where we were about to end up to where we did end up, most notably on the Canada-US-Mexico free trade agreement renegotiation. David brilliantly captained the process of getting to a successful close of that transaction with the Trump White House. And he has fascinating insights about the America we're all watching so closely right now. And I'm very sorry that he isn't able to be with us today. And we will do everything we can to get him scheduled at an early event of PACICC's Risk Series in the new year. And he does send his apologies. But I do actually have some live content that I think is sufficiently fresh and of interest that it's worth discussing with this group. So Danica, if you just want to put up the slides, and let's just jump right away to the next one. Our project for this year was to think about the resolution toolkit and what we could do to expand and enhance it at PACICC. And I'll explain a little bit about what on earth we're talking about. But just to start by reminding you of what PACICC is, apart from a curator of risk officers events like this one. We have a 3-part mandate. We're in charge of policyholder protection. We were established by the industry and have a core objective around minimizing the cost of insurance insolvencies on the surviving companies. And then finally, we have a high level and overarching mandate to help maintain a level of confidence among consumers and small businesses in particular in our sector, faith in our industry, which can get shaken when bankruptcies happen. Next slide, Danica. So when you think about when we were started, we were founded, conceived by the industry in 1988-89. We were conceived in response to a wave of failures. And we were given very broad powers. We were granted the authority to help with the liquidation and compensate legitimate policyholder claims. But we were also given the authority to engage in activities that might help avert failure. A very different thought process. And we actually have a documented list of options and ideas, assisting in the sale of, transferring, acting in reinsurance, issuing guarantees, providing financial support. But this is just an illustrative list. If you'll see in the opening clause, the list includes these items, but without limitation. Our board was given very broad flexibility, because the folks who were conceiving PACICC understood that every crisis is different, and that the right thing to do was to give our board full flexibility to solve it consistent with the three-part mandate. Next slide. The reality, of course, is that in the history of PACICC, we have never used those powers. We haven't, primarily because regulators, when they found an insurance company to be in distress, would discreetly manage it as best they could. And we would only be brought in at the end. We'd get a Friday afternoon call from a regulator in some province telling us to show up in a courtroom on Monday and bring our checkbook. And that would be the court that would place an insurance company under the Winding Up and Restructuring Act into liquidation. But over the last few years, we have engaged with the regulators in a dialogue about maybe being brought inside the tent earlier, to be given some runway to think about alternatives. And we have now successfully negotiated such intervention guidelines with AMF, with OSFI, with the BCFSA, and we anticipate within the next few months we will also be able to do this with Alberta, and next year we hope with FSRA, which will cover almost all of the prudentially supervised insurance companies in Canada. They're all slightly different, but the core element is that at a defined stage, when the regulator goes from concerned to really worried, because they believe there's a risk to the financial viability or solvency of an insurer, we're notified, which means that the little PACICC staff and me, we're privy to the watch lists of the primary prudential supervisors of Canada. And that certainly makes me a lot less interesting to talk to at industry cocktail parties than I used to think I was. But it does mean that we actually have confidential information. And if there's somebody in trouble, we're part of the potential solution. We didn't used to have these guides, and we, as a result, never had time to think, time to plan, or maybe time to consider whether any of these other powers we were granted when we were started might be useful. Next slide. Last year, our chief economist, Grant Kelly, did a deep dive into this subject and published a really interesting paper, which I know some of you will have taken a look at, in our Why Insurers Fail series. And we alternate each year between a research topic and the story of an actual failure. And Ian Campbell, Line Today, wrote this year's fantastic piece on the failure of Reliance Insurance. But last year, Grant published a very compelling research paper that showed that there were now 17 insurers in Canada large enough that if they were to fail, the required PACICC assessment would render other PACICC members technically insolvent, and made the case that this industry consolidation trend had led to a dynamic quite different than when we were originally conceived. But it also led to an outcome where fully exploring alternatives to liquidation becomes more and more compelling for the industry, because the costs of liquidation would be onerous on the balance sheets and MCT scores of the surviving companies. And so Grant teased out a series of scenarios in his research paper and started kind of blue skying what the tools would look like and how they could be used. But what we identified at the end of that research is that we did not have guidelines or criteria or an operating protocol for our board to use in thinking about how to use these powers and whether or not they should. And so that led to a major work exercise this year, which was for PACICC to think through how would our industry feel about all of this. In the end, the way I described it to many of the CEOs I talked with, we weren't asking for permission. We were trying to gain social permission. PACICC had these powers, but if we were actually to use them and use industry capital to keep a competitor alive for a while, as an example, how would the industry respond to that? It would be a shock, it would be a surprise, and they would certainly want to know what the PACICC board was thinking. So we built out a consultation paper and went to the industry and asked for feedback about how PACICC should respond in a range of different obvious tail risk scenarios, but credible scenarios. We tried to get some feedback on what tools or options might best fit those scenarios. Were there implications for our governance model? And how did our insurer members feel about that? And what criteria should our board use as they were thinking about how to respond to such a scenario? So we went out to the industry on July 31 with a thoughtful paper, next slide, Danica, which teased out 3 scenarios. The first was the failure of a mid-sized company as a result of a larger than modeled or maybe unmodeled cat risk that unfolded, where they ended up having more aggregation, more exposure than they had anticipated. And as a result, their combined capital and reinsurance was not adequate. The second scenario was topical, but we used it primarily for illustration purposes. Just imagine that a medium to larger size PACICC member insurer discovered after the fact that they had an accidentally more generous wording for business interruption for a pandemic than the rest of the industry, and more than they meant. But no case for denial of claim, full exposure, full policy limit. What would be the implications? Potential insolvency. Finally, we took a look at the case of a troubled company in specialty lines in the middle of a financial crisis. So there were no obvious buyers for this distressed insurer, but the lines of business they were offering were kind of essential to the Canadian market and could not be readily replaced by policyholders. So all of these were credible scenarios and all quite different. And important to flag, we at no point were asking for industry input on what would happen in the case of serial contagion and multiple failures after the megaquake. That's for another paper and another day. But if we are to imagine using resolution options in the quake scenario, it would be good to think about how they would work in the single company failure scenario first. Final part of our consultation exercise is that we had developed internally some draft criteria just to potentially guide our board in thinking about whether or not to act and how to act, and whether or not to use these powers and which ones they should use, and position our board to be in a position to confidently explain to the industry why they had done what they had done and why it was the right thing consistent with our 3-part mandate. And so I won't belabor these now, because at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you the final outcome and the final output. But we did have a list, and it would be fair to say that in the industry responses, not one of these items didn't get fully and comprehensively challenged, at least by a few, and in some cases by most of our member insurers, what turned out to be a fantastic exercise. So next slide. So just before I get to the survey results, we were thrilled to get the response we did. We ended up with feedback from roughly 80% of the industry by market share. Many companies responded directly and specifically. Some companies chose to put their commentary back into our kind of feedback loop through the IBC, who of course we included as a critical stakeholder in this. And the IBC, to their absolute credit, tried to have one of their standing committees tackle this, and then quickly worked out it was worthy of its own special working group, scrambled, produced a really quality working group. I know some of the names I could see on the participants list here were on that group. And in two half-day sessions, went through comprehensively and provided us with very detailed and extremely useful feedback. So suffice it to say that we hope to start an industry conversation. We ended up with a very good engaged dialogue with the vast majority of our industry. And then last thing to say before I get to the results of the survey is that we had the opportunity to run a workshop with the North Winds Institute. In my case, personally, I'm very sorry that I didn't get to do that at Langdon Hall and share at least one or two of those very large wine glasses that they have there with all the CEOs. But we did have a 3-hour virtual workshop with 20 plus CEOs, 30 plus C-suite folks from across the industry, and shared with them the survey results and had very good dialogue with that senior level group as well. And that was a material contributor to the fine tuning that led to our final product. Okay, so let's just talk quickly. We asked a practical question. Do you think we should develop alternatives to liquidation? And the vote was Danica. Good. So as you can see, I won't belabor it, we gained social permission with the industry's answer to this slide. But it's insurance, and as we all know, the devil's in the details. And so it's important not to get too excited about this very clear yes on question one, because there were much more divergent views as we go along. So we had strong support overall, but almost immediately there was some confusion, puzzlement, and some very hard questions. You know, is PACICC setting itself up as an alternate regulator? Who's in charge of this process? How would it work? If PACICC is going to do this stuff, does the little PACICC team remotely have the capacity and capability to do this kind of work? And who would they bring to the table to help them if they needed help? How would the governance model work, where this is secret confidential information about a distressed insurer, but we have a board populated with a majority of representatives of insurance companies? And if money is required, how would PACICC generate that? And so all of those were super questions. And then a very important one that surfaced early on, are we sure this is something that the regulators want? To which I can honestly say that we provided a very firm answer. OSFI has made it clear that regulators prefer more rather than fewer options. And we got exactly the same directional guidance from the AMF and BC. And we shared our consultation survey as a matter of course with all of the members of CCIR. Next slide. There were folks, and I'm going to give full credit to the folks in the 1.45% who said no. There were certainly a couple of companies who felt this was a bridge too far and that PACICC should stick to its knitting. And even among the people who said yes, there was some very important caveats that were in the feedback. An important reminder that failure is part of a normal market functioning. And so not all failures should be forestalled. It can be a healthy part of learning for an industry to have the people taking inappropriate risk at the wrong price or mismanaging their reserving or their claims practices to fail. That's good for everybody. There were also folks who were very worried that this would create moral hazard because consumers should own some obligation to properly select only responsibly managed and well-capitalized insurers, a critical point to appreciate. There were some folks who said, wouldn't it be better if you could just amend the Winding Up and Restructuring Act so that we could get our hands on the assets of the distressed insurer faster than 15 years to handle the claims, to which the obvious answer would be yes. But PACICC spent a decade trying to get the federal government to amend this legislation with absolutely zero success. it was last meaningfully amended in the second full term of Sir John A. Macdonald. And so maybe resolution alternatives do need to be explored. Finally, a lot of folks in the industry just reminded PACICC that our number one mission is to solve the federal backstop for quake issue. And there were certainly folks, especially at IBC, who spent a lot of time working with us on the quake issue, who didn't understand why we didn't have a fourth scenario involving multiple contagion and how would resolution options work in that case. And I've already addressed that point, but it's a totally legitimate concern to have raised. Next slide. So then we went to the criteria, the proposed draft criteria that we tabled, and boy, did we get a lot of feedback. And so at a high level, did people think it was a good idea to have criteria? Absolutely. So again, no stress, no strain, and the outliers were the folks who didn't think we should be doing this in the first place. Next slide. But when we asked, are there particular criteria you like or dislike, we had very firm response from large percentages of the industry. Yes, there are things that have to go, or we don't think make sense, or need to be so materially amended that if you don't amend them, they should just be discarded. Next slide. We also asked, are there things that should be added? And as you can see, we had 2/3 of our industry happy to suggest additions to the list. More, in fact, than there were people suggesting deletions. Just fascinating process. So what did we learn? One, and thank you to all of you who were engaged in this exercise. The membership of PACICC, the insurer members of our industry, took this very seriously. And so the idea that we should have a protocol and some criteria strongly supported. We got fantastic questions and comments about all of it. We got diverse perspectives. And there was a range of folks who felt it'd be better to have very strict button-down criteria, and others who felt it was still wise to keep our board in a position to be flexible and respond on the fly to the case circumstances of a unique circumstance. So fascinating stuff to receive. And then some very clear insights that we picked up in a little bit more detail here. When does the PACICC engagement begin, and how would that work? And what would the decision-making process be with the regulators? So again, just making sure this was clear. Is there new and enhanced legal liability for PACICC and its board? And have you guys thought about that? Good insurance question. How are you thinking about evaluating options? Your criteria don't seem to have anything about materiality. You say it's supposed to be cheaper than liquidation. Shouldn't there be some clarity as to how much cheaper? Because any valuation of liabilities in a crisis is probably going to be off by some actuarial rule of thumb. We had a very clear idea in our draft protocol and criteria that the board and senior management of a distressed insurer should probably be put by the wayside. And there was a lot of concern about whether that was a premature thing to do to a distressed insurer, especially if it was simply an unmodeled risk that nobody could have foreseen. We had a very general criteria around, events outside the normal. And lots of folks are going, that's really vague. Are you sure that's helpful? We had a strict requirement that no industry capital would be used to revive a competitor and that they would have to exit the market. But a whole bunch of folks then politely asked, what if a buyer wants to retain the entity or the brand? Shouldn't that be allowed? Is your exit the market requirement too explicit and not flexible enough? Very good questions about, is this list of criteria one, some, or all? Do you have to tick every box at the PACICC board, or just some of them, or any one of them would be legitimate? And then again, finally, this concern about our governance model and how would it work? So next slide shows you scenario one. And I'm not going to go through all of the detail here. So Danica just popped through these slides at a decent pace. We gave scenarios around an assisted sale and an assisted sale with industry cash involved. And we asked for feedback as to whether or not these were good ideas. Next slide shows that our industry was ready to see PACICC intervene, but next slide, so sure that they liked all the alternatives. So next slide shows the feedback we got about stay out of this entirely, assist in a transaction for sure. And if you have to maybe pledge your assessment power to help finesse that transaction, that'd be okay. But if you need cash on the barrel in advance to help finesse this transaction, we're not so sure. But what did we learn in general? Sorry, you can go ahead, Danica. What we learned in general was that options we were tabling in scenario one were legit. And we even had folks ready to contemplate the extreme version of us doing an industry assessment because we thought it would be a cheaper than the assessment we would have to send out after the liquidation of that company. Next slide shows you scenario two. And
sorry, if I could just say we've had some members saying that between you and the slides that are showing, sometimes it's if they want to see the slides and not you or vice versa, they can just click on one or the other to flip them. So I just wanted to address that because there's chat going on sidebar about how they to switch screens. So I know they want to see you, but the slides are also good. So
well, I don't need to see me at all. So
good.
All right,
Thanks.
I don't need to change how I'm proceeding here, though.
Not at all. It's coming in very clearly. Thank you very much.
Super. All right, so I'm now on scenario two, which, as you folks will recall, was the business interruption case. And so there, we again asked as the top line question, if the liquidation would lead to a $2.5 billion PACICC assessment, and there were these options and they were likely cheaper, how would the industry feel? And so we got strong support for engagement here, though with a slightly higher percentage disagreeing. And then when we asked, next slide, for the specifics around the options we put on the table, we got the following feedback. And again, Danica, if you jump to the next slide, we seem to have lost the actual results there. Did you jump 2 slides or did I accidentally leave one out? There we go. So the idea of the assisted sale continued to get strong support. The idea that maybe PACICC should have a bridge insurer so that we could keep this thing running for a while until we worked out the situation had kind of 50-50, just under. And the idea that we could use reinsurance, maybe retroactive, some form of guarantee, some adverse development cover, some idea around that actually had very strong support. And as you'll recall, reinsurance was listed specifically as one of the options in our founding bylaw. Next slide. So again, we had more support, honestly, than we expected for engagement in this scenario, and the idea that we could take a look at a full range of options. There was clearly industry appetite if the alternative was a $2.5 billion assessment. And just to remind you how assessments at PACICC work, we have the right to assess up to 1.5% of direct written premium in any 1 year of all member insurers. And so this year, that's $934 million that we could assess, and we have no limit on the number of years we can assess that for. So in this case, would be 2 3/4 years worth of assessment, all of which would land as either cash on the barrel in 30 days or contingent liability for the rest on your balance sheet and on your MCT. So you can see why there is an appetite from the CEOs filling out this survey and signing off on it to see what the alternatives would be. Okay, So the last point I'll make there is that the bridge insurer option, we put in, I would say honestly, partly so that folks would have something to firmly say no to, because we honestly thought it might be already used this line, a bridge too far, and pardon the pun. But in fact, there was just under 50% ready to say yes. And among the folks who said no in the comments, it was very clear that the no was mostly associated with, we don't know how much this would cost, we don't know how it would work, we don't know how it would be run, where would the capital come from, all very practical operational questions, to which if we provided answers, it's entirely possible that the support for this option would climb. Next slide. Our final scenario was an uncertain assessment, but alternatives would still likely be cheaper. And so there's an economic crisis, a fiscal collapse in derivatives markets, mortgage-backed securities, imagine. And so when you would normally have an asset that would be perfectly saleable, there's no lineup of buyers. And so what would you do in a case like that? And so we asked the industry, how would you feel if we were to explore alternatives? Continued to get support, again, with a slightly larger outlier group. And then we asked specifically, on the next slide, around, you can jump over this. Yeah, so we then asked about an assisted sale option and the bridge insurer option again. And the results of that were quite clear. In that scenario, even if the assessment risk is less or unclear, alternatives to having an important specialist insurer fail and causing a crisis in the capacity, for instance, in troubled lines of business in the middle of financial crisis, it might be very much better for the industry's reputation to avert that through an assisted sale or perhaps even a bridge insurer. Next slide. Again, broad support. Some really great questions came from the industry around this. How does this apply to branches with a home office? Those of you who have read Ian's paper on the failure of Reliance Insurance in Canada would know that OSFI closed the branch of a severely distressed US home office. So it's a very live and practical question. And I think we can all think of another insurer that wobbled globally in 2008 that had a really important Canadian branch. There were real questions about our scenario, though, because a lot of the lines that you could imagine as being specialty lines are not actually covered by PACICC, because we do not cover surety, marine, aviation, for-profit D&O, etc. And so there were questions about whether this was a credible enough scenario. And there was also a concern that if we were to intervene, how do we know there wouldn't be a buyer? And we might scare them off. And some other points of folks thinking, well, if there's money available from PACICC to help finesse the transaction, you might have bidders asking for unreasonable terms because they knew there was money available from the industry. So all super important points to take on board. And again, the bridge insurer option was attractive to folks, but more detail was welcome. Okay, I'm nearing the close here because we did give our members in this survey a chance to offer final comment. So once again, don't forget the federal backstop. And between PACICC and IBC, we were in a full meeting this morning with Finance Canada on that critical file, and a meeting that you probably wished would have happened 5 years ago. But we now have full engagement with the right folks at the table and a timeline to address this central gap in the kind of public infrastructure of Canada. So we're on it. We're working every lever we can pull. More detail on the bridge insurer. A reminder that our current assessment mechanism with this very adverse contingent liability risk was conceived long before IFRS 17 and actually long before contingent liability was properly understood. So it would be very good for PACICC to go back and try again at coming up with a better assessment mechanism. Some practical questions about how our governance model would work, etc. So I won't belabor the rest, except to say that our industry was fully engaged on the last page of the consultation exercise, which makes me feel really good about the engagement we secured. So what was the outcome? Well, we took the industry feedback, and especially very detailed feedback from the Special IBC Working Group, and totally revamped our draft criteria and created a protocol with accompanying criteria, which we presented for full dialogue with our committee of the independent directors of our board, and then formally with our board of directors, who met yesterday and unanimously approved the revamped protocol. A fantastic outcome of a really super consultation exercise. We will road test the new protocol in a series of desktop simulations planned with the AMF and with OSFI in 2021. And because I'm sure you'd be curious, here's the final version. It's a 3-step flow. And so, first of all, the board has to conclude, even before that, the independent directors of our board in their standing committee, the Pearl Committee, have to conclude that PACICC's mission, one or more components of that mission, are at risk unless we intervene. If that's true, then we go to step 2. Step 2, and here we are very specifically trying to address the concerns that were tabled by the industry about who decides what and when. All of the following must be met. The supervisor, not PACICC, the supervisor has determined that recovery is unlikely and the company is in stage 3 of the stage 4 flow, that there's runway, that there's time, that this isn't happening on Friday evening, that there is practical time to explore properly what alternatives might look like, that PACICC is able to secure appropriate resources to work on this, that any resolution alternative be conclusively demonstrated to be materially less expensive than liquidation. This addressed very specific points tabled at the North Winds Institute workshop. Though it's important to flag that it could be hard cost-benefit evaluation as well as an analysis of the downside risk for industry reputation. And finally, if there is going to be an assessment of the industry required to fund the resolution action, then another set of criteria must also be met. So next slide. In step 3 of this flow, if the Pearl Committee comes to the board and says that we have a scenario and we're going to need to assess money, then there are 2 other conditions that need to be met. Both need to be met. One, that jointly the supervisor and PACICC are satisfied with the governance of the troubled insurer during whatever transition period is involved. So we're no longer saying all heads must roll. And there were lots of folks who correctly pointed out that that might not be remotely fair, or you might simply be leaving the distressed insurer with no competent folks to manage in that transition period. But second, we have to ensure that no industry funds end up in the pockets of the current capital providers of the distressed insurer, and that the industry funds will not be used to revive this competitor under current ownership. And that creates the flexibility that our industry suggested around what possible outcomes there might be for a buyer who wanted to keep the legal entity or keep the brand, or both. There's a couple of asterisks in here. So the last slide here simply shows what those are. Very clearly, this is intended for single company scenarios. It is not intended or designed to respond to serial insurance failure after a major NatCat. And second, this is more of a reminder of our governance design No money can flow from PACICC in the form of an industry assessment without a vote of the board, including a quorum of our industry directors. So once our independent directors committee has checked all of this set of criteria off and is satisfied that they can be met with the proposed resolution action, that committee calls for a meeting of the full board, but at that point, it will be necessary for either the regulator or the distressed member insurer to permit the Pearl Committee to share the name of the distressed member insurer with the industry directors, trusting that in confidence they will act in full fiduciary role and honor the confidentiality of that information. So thank you for your patience. That is the outcome now adopted of our consultation exercise. I don't think there's a dramatic final slide. Did I have a wind up? I don't think so. Except to once again say thank you. Again, looking at the list here, I can see many of the folks who were involved in sending their company's response or were part of the IBC special working group, given no notice that they were having to carve time out of their important day jobs to help with this industry work. I'd also like to thank, there's a couple of members of the PACICC board who have dialed in for this risk officers forum. And I want to thank them for their commitment to the industry and the huge amount of extra time that they have committed outside their critical leadership roles at their own insurers to help our industry make sure that we're properly prepared for worst case scenarios. So I'm happy to answer any questions you've got, but I think I was assigned 50 minutes, and Ian, that's
You're perfect. And let's throw it open. Do people have questions or comments on some of the feedback that came through in the survey? You're getting a very timely presentation, and for anyone that's joining us late prior to my introduction, we had a late last minute cancellation, unfortunately, with our keynote speaker, and Alistair took this gig on a day's notice and pulled these slides together overnight, and was busy all day yesterday with a board meeting, a very long board meeting, and has put together a comprehensive presentation, and it's hot off the press because this incorporates Alistair's presentation, some of the feedback we got at yesterday's board meeting in terms of steps forward. You can see he's been in place now for a couple of years. Alistair is not a caretaker CEO by any means, so this is it's been on the books forever that we've had these powers, but actually getting around to fleshing them out and next steps is a big step, and it's exciting to present that to you today. Do we have any questions on this? And if we don't, I heard from in one of the satisfaction surveys last time that 3 hours is a long time to go without bio breaks and just a break between sessions. So this is probably a great time to add 5 minutes to the program to give yourself a break, get up, grab a coffee, or attend to messages, whatever. And we can rejoin this broadcast in 5 minutes time, and we will hear from Jeff Shields is going to talk to us about risk talent in the industry. So take a moment now, just take a break for the next 5 minutes. I have 2:21, so call it 2:25, 2:26, and we will look to carry on with the program then. And Alistair, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Well done, thank you. And we will see everybody back here in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we are back. Welcome back. We are going to continue on with our next presentation. And our next speaker is going to discuss the issue of talent risk in Canada's P&C insurance industry. Many of you have been involved with our benchmark ERM surveys. We've asked you at the end of the surveys, now done on a biannual basis. Our next survey is taking place next June. We've asked you to identify the risks and concerns over the next 1 to 3 years and the next 3 to 10 years. And we started to compare these short-term and long-term risks back in 2017. Human capital made the list, the top or a risk over the next 3 to 10 years in 2017. It was not deemed to be a pressing concern back then for the short term. It didn't appear on the list of impending risks in the next 1 to 3 years. But in 2018, human capital as an issue, a risk issue dealt with by the industry, advanced up the 3 to 10 year list of risks, but again, didn't make the short-term risk list in 2018. It did, however, in 2019. So it is becoming more top of mind for the industry. It was in 2019 cited as both a short-term risk and a long-term risk over the coming period. So we went looking for a speaker who could address this issue capably and approach Jeff Shields. Jeff is Senior Vice President, Insurance Division of Strategic Resource Consultants, Inc. And the topic he's going to talk to you about today is talent risk in the P&C insurance industry. Jeff is a seasoned veteran of our industry. He's got an extensive network of insurance executives and professionals. He's led a high-performing teams across a wide range of disciplines: finance, strategy, risk, compliance, actuarial, technology, human resources, and operations. Jeff has worked closely with senior leaders in all functional areas. He's well-versed in financial and operational consulting services. He's a chartered accountant by profession with a business administration degree from York University. Jeff is a longtime advocate of professional development across the insurance industry. Many of you will know him as a regular speaker and moderator at various leading industry conferences and seminars. He gives of his time generously to charitable and nonprofit organizations. And kind of a risky move here, he's also told me that he likes barbershop singing. So if things get dull during any point in the conversation, we may ask you to maybe belt out Georgia on My Mind just to tie it into the Trump election. That would be kind of topical. So welcome, Jeff. Maybe you could, I don't see you on the screen. I'll ask Danica to pivot to Jeff's slides. And yep, perfect. Okay, thanks, Danica. And welcome, Jeff. So I'll hand the mic over to you, and I've got some questions. And so as we go through Jeff's presentation, again, we want this to be very, very interactive. So if you have questions or comments, do raise your hand using the taskbar, and I will call out your name and ask you to unmute yourself. You'll pose your question or your comment, and then mute yourself, and Jeff will address your issue or concern. And we'll make this more conversational over the next hour. And so I will stay on screen here, but I will mute myself, and Jeff, I'll hand the mic over to you. Thank you.
Ian, thanks very much. I'll assume by a nod that you can hear me, Ian. All right, you're the only one I can see, so you're the only one that I can get feedback from. So
loud and clear, it's great.
So first of all, thanks very much for having me. I will tell you that there's an old adage in this industry that you're not supposed to follow children, pets, or Alistair Campbell. So I'm not sure that that's the bait and switch there. But I'm good with it though. I'm looking forward to this presentation. Really appreciate the attendance here today. Great attendance. A lot of names that I know well. So I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to advance one slide because that picture, it was not only pre-COVID, it was probably pre-COVID, looking at the hair color. So we'll throw another slide up just while I'm covering off a couple of things. Sorry, can somebody?
Danica, can you advance Jeff's slides? You have that posted. Jeff is just going to speak to the slides. Thank you very much.
Oh, a little too far. One back. There. Oh, there you go. Perfect. Wonderful. I don't even know if you can see that anyway, but bottom line is, look, I'm new to this kind of format of presenting. I'm normally a wanderer when I present. I feed off audience body language and vibe, and I think a little bit of humor along the way. So I'll have to just stick with some cartoons to do that today. But in fact, I think looking at the names in the room, some of you will be there at one conference when a fellow CFO and I danced into the room in boxing robes to the theme of Rocky to start our debate on accounting issues. So this is definitely different for me, but resilience and adaptation, I think, are what we're all about these days. So I will I'll stream on, and I will look forward to some questions along the way, and certainly at the end as well. So next slide. So what is talent risk? Look, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here. There's lots of studies and other things on this, but bottom line, just to set the stage, how I see talent risk, and there's lots of definitions. I see it as a risk that an organization will reach a point where it does not have sufficient staff with the skill sets necessary to achieve its objectives and sustain its competitive advantage, be that during normal operations or a material business disruption. Because let's not forget what what talent you may have that'll get you through in normal times. If there's a sudden disruption or other things, may not be what you're looking for. In terms of how you look at this as a risk practice, I mean, normally people think of talent risk as a subset of operational risk. But it really sort of underlines and underpins a lot of the other risk. It certainly has implications for financial risk, especially in this industry where half our expenses are people related. Reputational risk, people do the wrong things, they can definitely create reputational risk, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of think of talent risk almost as its own sort of category. Essentially, you want to boil it down, and it basically comes down to, if talent demand is greater than talent availability in any of its forms, that's going to create challenges for your organization or for the industry as a whole, depending on whatever level you're looking at. And like any other form of risk, it's a function of probability. In this case, the probability of attracting, developing, and retaining the right talent, and severity, and that's basically the impact of the problems you're going to get if that doesn't happen. And like any other risk factor, you do the same things that you would do on any other type of risk. You've got to assess the risk, align your organization around it, find ways to mitigate it. And that can be through avoidance, reduction, transfer, acceptance, all the same things that you would find with any other form of risk. Next slide, if you can. But look, I'm not the guy who's going to take you through all technical tables and everything else. That is something that I'm sure you can find in other places. There's a reason, first of all, why we're talking about talent risk today. I think Ian set that up. That in 2000 and I guess it was 17, was it, that the survey started to show human capital, which is the same thing I think as talent risk, human capital risk, as hitting the radar screen, right? And by 2019, which is the last time the survey was done, it's now in the top 7 that you guys score in the 1 to 3 year time frame and the 3 to 10 year time frame. So it's one of the reasons we're talking about this today is because you all said this is an important topic and it's becoming increasingly so. In terms of why I'm the one presenting today, well, that PACICC would have to tell you, but it's certainly not because I'm particularly camera friendly. It's certainly not because I'm with one of the big global consulting firms that has reams of sort of data and proprietary studies on talent risk. There's others that can deal with that. To some degree, it's probably because I speak the language a little bit, having formerly been a chief risk officer and a chief financial officer before I moved into the world of talent as a recruiter and consultant. And possibly it's because I've been with a lot of different size companies in this industry and nature of companies in this industry, small, medium, very large, small technology firms, et cetera. So I've kind of been around and seen a lot of things myself, but also through my clients and others I deal with on my recruiting sort of day-to-day work as a recruiter and my work as an M&A consultant. I see a lot more. So that's probably a lot of the reason. And look, I'm not going to pretend that I see everything there is to see in the industry. My focus, for example, as a recruiter is on experience level and leadership level staff. So I don't on a day-to-day basis, for example, do a lot of work at the sort of entry level and junior level. So there are gaps in my knowledge base like anybody else, but I did take some time heading into this presentation to call up, I think it was about 20 of folks in this industry who were at the C-suite level, CEOs, CROs, CFOs, CHROs, and sort of bounce around a little bit with them, kind of what I'm thinking and make sure I'm not, sort of missing any gaps. And they gave me some great insights, and I've sort of pulled those into some of what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, if you can. So the first question I asked of the execs was, why do you think that talent risk has sort of hit the risk radar over the last couple of years? The first answer I got was a bit of surprise from a lot of them that aren't CH or CROs, for example, why it wasn't on the list sooner and why it wasn't higher. So it was pretty much a constant answer I got from all of them, because I mean, talent, at that level is definitely, something that's on the radar screens. It is, a resource that's critical to manage in all organizations, especially in financial services, where so much of what we do is dependent on talent. And so, there's a lot of different reasons why, we saw, though, that it moved up the risk radar. And they understand, the ones that they mentioned were, they certainly seen many studies, surveys, reports, whatever you want to call it, both from locally, the Canadian insurance sector, which I'll talk about in a second, but also all sorts of reports at the global insurance sector, Canadian sector across the economy, global, economy, where talent risk and risk shortages are just becoming more and more significant and important on the risk radars all over the place. But it's also largely about company experience. I'm going to talk a little bit more about transformation and disruption, but also just generally things like, the hard market as which we haven't seen in, 15, 14, 16 years, depending on how you want to look at it, has all of a sudden, I think, illustrated some gaps in our knowledge base, because a lot of people in this industry have never been through a hard market. So it's kind of raised some of those issues around skill gaps and capabilities, et cetera. And there's just some of the day-to-day realities they've been facing. I think a lot of companies have just been finding it harder and harder on a day-to-day basis to find, attract, and retain staff. So a lot of reasons why it's hit the risk radar. I'll talk just quickly about a couple of those. If you can flip to the next slide. I think this was probably the number one reason it started to hit the risk register. And that was the headline after the 2017 IIC survey. They, as probably many of you will know, do a workforce study. They did their first one, I think that was the first in 2007, and they do it every 5 years. So it was done in 2012 and again in 2017. Results kind of came out in 17 and 18 on demographics in the industry. And this headline right here was a pretty critical one. 27% of the P&C workforce is expected to retire by 2027. And we're 3 years closer to that now since the results came out. And, I will tell you that I think this was, even though it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise because demographics move slowly, I think that kind of number was such a material number that I think it put it on a lot of people's radar screens. The P&C, if you look at sort of the broader P&C marketplace, insurers, brokers, et cetera, there's 132,000 people that this industry employs in Canada. And so if we're talking 27%, we're talking about 35,000 people retiring in the next, what's now probably 6-7 years left, right? So that's a material number, and I think, drove some of that. I mentioned some of the day-to-day stuff, and some of that was highlighted as well in the next slide, again from the IIC survey. A lot of transformation going on in this industry over the last couple of years, particularly. I'm trying to think of a single, insurance company or major broker or, in fact, every size company who's not going through one sort of major transformation, if not more. And that could be a systems transformations and overhauls, shift into the, sort of digital marketplace, in acquisition mode, demutualizing, rebranding. It's hard to find a company that isn't going through some sort of major transformation initiative as we speak today. So, and transformation brings talent risk along with it. It's critical when you're going through major transformation to have the right people to lead those transformations, the change management involved in those transformations, pulling people out of their day jobs to do these transformations and trying to backfill into their day jobs, retention concerns, as some of that work can be kind of hard and challenging and not fun sometimes, so it creates retention concerns. And of course, post-transformation, there can be entirely new types of talent that are going to be required to drive that business. So all of those things obviously have impacts on talent risk. And this was very much recognized in this survey. I think you'll see the bottom stat there is probably the most critical one. Do executives in this industry think that their organizations are prepared for the future talent demands associated with transformation? And less than 10% strongly agreed that in 2017 that was the case, and over 25% disagreed either somewhat or strongly. So that tells you that the talent to lead these transformation exercise is certainly there's some concern and some need to look at that some more was pretty clear that came out of that study. So I think a lot of those things were impacting things. And the other was, and if you can flip to the next slide, the other is what I called as general disruption. So, I had a similar presentation of this a couple of years ago. I did a similar sort of I call it unscientific set of conversations with C-suite execs. That's my equivalent of doing a formal study, and sort of tabulated some of the results of those. And my key question that I asked the C-suite execs at the time was relative to what you've seen in the past. What's the current level of disruption, change, transformation, complexity, general craziness in your world today? And the answers were very clear. Single C-suite exec that put the number under 7. There was probably the biggest category or tied with the biggest was a 10 out of 10, and several of the others who were less than that basically told me the only reason that it's there is they're leaving room because just in case things get worse. But relative to what they'd ever seen in their careers, it was probably one of the most sort of times of disruption in their careers. And this was only 2 years ago, 2018, right around the time when talent risk was hitting the radar screen. And again, disruption just causes talent challenges. And I asked the execs at the time, if you can flip to the next slide, so what kind of factors were driving that disruption? And, there's always factors that drive disruption, but I think the issue at the time and continues today is that it's usually one or two that will rise up at a particular period of time. The others are a little bit, benign for a while, and then things will flip and something else will go up the radar screen, something else will come down. That, I think what everybody's saying is that just simply isn't the case, that technology, demographics, regulation, distribution, M&A, hard market, industry cyclicality, probably about the only thing that wasn't really on people's real risk radar at the time or disruption radar at the time was the economy, relatively benign. But of course, even that has its impacts, years of low interest rates on what that does to the to our industry and the need for lower combined ratios to offset it. So really a lot of things going on, a lot of disruption, and you need your talent to be really working effectively and efficiently during those kind of times in order to get through them and manage through them. So all very good reasons why talent risk was sort of driving up the radar screen over the last few years. So I guess the next question is, if talent risk is on the radar screen, what does that mean? How do we drill down into the next level of talent risk? And so I was out and looked at a lot of different studies. There's lots of different ones. Everybody's got their own sort of spin on what talent risk looks like at the next level down. KPMG, for example, they divide in talent risk into 5 categories: capability, cost, compliance, capacity, and connection. All the consulting firms have great acronyms for everything. The 5 C's, and then they kind of drill down from there. I got a little simpler. I just simply asked my C-suite contacts when I was in these calls the last couple of weeks, what are you most concerned about? What really are you worried about when it comes to talent risk? And I got a bunch of different answers, and I think depending on what company you were with and where kind of you were in your journey with that company, it changed a little bit. But these were kind of the key answers that came out, and it's all things I'm seeing at the ground level as well when I look at talent risk. It's staff shortages generally, just overall, do we have enough staff in this industry to get where we need to go over the next little while? Even if we do we have it by certain experience levels? And I'll get into that a bit more. Do we have it in the right functional areas? Even if we have the right number of staff, do we have them in it with the right skill sets to be effective? And are those skill sets technical deficiencies or soft skill deficiencies? Again, everybody had kind of different perspectives depending on where their companies were. Diversity came up on, sorry, yeah, Ian, yeah.
I gotta say, I love the bottom of the slide. Totally unscientific set of conversations. Very humorous.
And diversity came up on every single, I think every single conversation almost with all the C-suite execs. And then just sort of a bunch of other things in the areas of retention and turnover and multi-generational workforces. So explored those a little bit more, and they all kind of make sense to me why those are concerns. If you can flip to the next slide. I mean, at the end of the day, staffing and talent risk is really a function of both supply and demand. And we've talked about the fact that due to retirements, supply is going to be down. Now, there's offsets to that. If we can attract the right talent into this industry, and I'll get into that in a little bit, then you can certainly offset, some of the retirement reductions and sort of fill that gap. But even if you can do that, the question is, what's the demand looking like? And I think a lot of people will argue that demand for staff is going to fall over the next little while. So is that a mitigator against some of these concerns? And I can understand why that would be the case, particularly automation, and we'll talk about that in a second. But certainly industry consolidation, and obviously still a long time to go. But we just heard a pretty major announcement yesterday around potential consolidation in this industry again, and it's been happening at the insurer level, it's been happening at the broker level, it's now starting at the MGA level. So it's definitely is another factor that will potentially reduce the demands for staffing over the next while. And then there's sort of all the stuff that's always there, outsourcing, which doesn't really change demands, just shifts globally where it is, or offshoring. Prioritization, can you just filter down and focus on the right things and reduce your staffing need because you're not sort of spreading yourself out too thin? All those things certainly are factors that are going to bring staffing demands down. And if it was just that, then I'd say, okay, staffing demands are not going to be as high moving forward, particularly automation. And I'll just the next slide and see what McKinsey has to say. Now, this was a global study in insurance and P&C insurance. Says that 23% of jobs in P&C insurance could be displaced by automation by 2030. Again, not too different a time frame than we're talking about on our retirement fronts. And the remaining roles will require higher digital proficiency. So they've kind of looked at that and said, the most digitally advanced insurers have 15 times more digital talent than compared with less digitally advanced insurers, et cetera. So, certainly when it comes to overall reductions due to automation, there is a potential for seeing that happen. But there are factors going the other way. And if you can flip it to the next slide. You've got just general economic and industry growth, macro issues. You've got just pace of change and disruption. If it continues to be high, it's going to continue to drive the need for more staffing to address it. Demand for niche skill sets. We know that we're seeing that in actuarial and analytics and data science and other areas. We're seeing, rising regulator expectations. We're seeing new risks arise that need talent to address, like cyber. We're seeing regulation like IFRS 17 that's certainly driven the need for finance talent up over the last little while. And again, every time there's a major change in auto or other regulations, it creates a need for more talent. So where's that going to end up? Is the balance going to be tipping in one way or the other? I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not going to completely tell you, but I'll tell you it's certainly not entirely in one direction. In 2017, as part of the IAC study, 7 out of 10, I think, or 70% said that they thought that there was still going to be growth in staff, despite some of these other factors. And let's face it, a lot of the factors, automation, consolidation, outsourcing, offshore, all those things have been there over the last 4 or 5 years as well, 10 years, and the industry continues to grow staff. So overall, question mark over staffing demands. But regardless of whether there's issues overall in terms of total staffing, there certainly is at certain levels. And one of the biggest ones we looked at was the demographics, and the IAC study was all about the demographics. And there were some pretty startling sort of results happening with that. So basically, when you look at our under 40 people, again, this is 2017, but demographics don't change dramatically. And so in 2017, 45% of the workforce was under 40. And that pretty much was the same percentage as it was 10 years prior. However, in both the over 50 to 59 and 60 plus, that was growing as a percentage. So still smaller than the other categories, but growing. And so they rose from a total of 25% of the workforce to over 30% in 2017. And the flip was entirely in that group that's now 40 to 49 years old. So the 40 to 49-year-olds declined by, I think it's 6 or 7% there, and that's pretty significant reduction in one particular sort of block. And who is in that block generally? Again, there's a lot of specifics, and you can look at it, but these are generally the folks who are going to have, if they started their career in insurance, they're going to have 15 to 25 years experience. These are our senior technical people. These are our mid-management. These are our leaders. These are there's a lot of pretty key talent that's in that bucket, and that bucket is declining. And when I talk to, as a percentage of total, right? And so when I talk to industry CEOs, CFOs, CHROs, all of them raise this issue as a concern, this sort of barbell, right? Of where our next leaders coming from, where our next senior sort of technical people coming from. So definitely an issue. Next slide, if you can. So, and let's just say, for argument's sake, that everything was perfect in terms of the demographic, everything was perfect in terms of total staffing. That still doesn't tell the whole story, because you've still got the skills issue. If the people who you have the wrong skill sets to be successful moving forward, then there's still going to be talent risk, changes required in order to make that happen. And so again, IC survey had some pretty good data on that, and looked at where the skill sets are going to be in most demand. I thought it was interesting that when it came to analytics and data analysis, I don't think anybody was surprised with that, with everything that's going on with AI and machine learning, and all the pricing and actuarial, all those things that are really moving forward very, very quickly. No surprise there that was on the list. But look at a lot of the other ones that are on the list. They're more soft skill based, which I thought was obviously very interesting. It's customer service and creativity and innovation and problem solving and communication, and all those things are soft skills, and those soft skills are really hitting the horizon as being more critical over the next little while. And all of this, of course, was pre-COVID. We'll talk a little bit at the end. I didn't want to put a lot of, I should have mentioned that earlier, I didn't want to put a lot of COVID specific things into this part, because the surveys were done before COVID. COVID is still sort of in process, and there's still a lot to be learned. But I'd love to answer some questions and talk a little bit about COVID at the end more informally, because I think there are some interesting impacts that COVID's going to have on everything. So would love to get going on that. Yeah.
On that slide, so do you think it's employers are looking for more malleable employees that don't come out like automatrons? That obviously AI is very important, leading the list, data analytics and whatnot. But like you said, there's a big chunk of just very soft skills that you can kind of build your own employee or shape them to the culture of your organization. Has that changed over time? Is that
I when you look at, for example, job-specific technical being so far down on the list, you wouldn't have seen that, at least in terms of being much more important. There's still a good chunk that are somewhat more important, but in terms of, you wouldn't have seen that a few years ago, right? And so what you're seeing is that, with automation and standardization and some of those things, some of the sort of technical things are now being picked up by systems and technology, and so it's the people who need to be able to run those technologies and build them and make sure that what's coming out of them makes sense and has that judgment to say, okay, that's the answer this computer is spitting out. Does that really make sense? Or does somebody need to quality control that? Does somebody need to sense check that and have those sort of skill sets to do that? People have to program these systems in the first place, and you can't do that unless you really have a broader mindset. In an area of transformation and change and disruption, you can have all the best ideas in the world, but if you can't communicate them, align people around them, figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work, then they're going to fail anyway, right? So I think that's probably a lot of the reason why those are there. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So the big question, I guess, is, are the types of skills that are on this list ones that we can take the people who are already in this industry and train them and help them pick up some of these skill sets, or are these ones that we're going to have to go outside to get and bring in? And I think it's going to be a combination. Certainly, there's certain things in analytics and data analysis, things that we just are kind of new, and we're going to have to look at where that comes from. Other things like leadership, training and teamwork and those things, can they be taught? I think a lot of them can. So I think that's going to be an interesting question. We'll talk a little bit more when I talk about mitigation about those things. Next slide, if you can. Thank you. So I said diversity is an area that was talked about a lot. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on diversity. There those that are, but I think when you look at the statistics in this industry, I think again the ISC had some good stats on this. There's it highlights a few things. So for example, and diversity can mean a lot of things, right? Diversity can mean gender, or ethnicity, or age, or orientation, or just thought, just how you think and how you approach the world. So lots of forms that diversity can take. But certainly one of the ones that has had a lot of attention historically in insurance has been on the gender side. So let's just take a look at the stats that they have there. And on the surface, you could think, well, maybe we're doing okay on that front. 10 years ago, it was 61% female in the industry, which is certainly higher than you'll see in a lot of industries. It's still growing, not by much, but it's 61 to 62%. So high level, you could just look at that, and if you didn't drill down, you could say things maybe look okay. Still arguable, maybe they look okay. But you do have to, like anything else, you do have to drill down, and you sort of say, well, is that jiving with what I'm seeing out there? And I think there's certainly some very prominent examples of women leading large and small and all sorts of size organizations in the insurance sector out there that get a lot of attention, and there's some wonderful women leading organizations in this industry. In fact, that was not the case a while back. I can remember very clearly 25 years ago when Jan Tomlinson came up when I was with Chubb. I was the head of finance at Chubb, and she came up to Canada, and I believe, if I remember correctly, she was the first female CEO of an insurer in Canada, or at least a good-sized insurer in Canada, and one of the few in financial services. And since then, there's been tons of great examples of female CEOs and who in this industry. But specific examples do not necessarily make for the final answer. And if you look the next slide, you'll see that maybe some of that is not as prevalent as perhaps we might think. Over 60% of the industry is women, and less than 60% are in frontline management. Less than 50% are in middle management. Less than 35% are at the senior and executive ranks. So when you start looking at how this is permeating through the organizations, despite some of these great high-profile examples, it's not necessarily as pervasive as we may think. So, how are we going to make sure that this perpetuates and works its way up through all levels of the organization? Because it is important. People get mentoring opportunities. People get just encouragement and engagement, and from seeing folks that have some of their same experiences, working up through organizations. And this is just something from a gender standpoint. There's certainly lots of other diversity areas you can look at, and there's some in the study. Please, I encourage you to go and take a look at that. But the concerns are probably higher when it comes to some of the other aspects of diversity. It doesn't matter kind of what you look at. The industry is either a little behind or well behind other industries when it comes to ethnicity and other factors, and are definitely even further behind when it comes to the senior some management and senior executive ranks. So definitely something to look at. We'll talk about mitigation in a bit, but definitely an area of concern. Next. Turnover raised as a concern, and again, for good reason. I mean, there are some reasons to be positive. Financial services generally tends to be lower than other industries in terms of turnover, and P&C is insurance, at least in 2017 timeframe, was right at around that level. That still double digits though, right? 10, double-digit turnover, 10 and change percent. But probably the bigger issue is where that turnover is happening, and the most significant turnover is happening at the sort of under 40, level. Age 65 plus is turnover because of retirements primarily, but under that is turnover for other reasons, and so you are seeing turnover rates, at what is now our largest cohort, the under 40 sort of cohort. Is certainly into the 6, 8, 10, 12 up to sort of 17%. So some signals that there's good reasons to be concerned about turnover and retention. And again, we'll talk about mitigation in a bit, but there's certainly some reasons to be concerned, and especially when you layer on top of that some issues around how millennials see the world, and I'll get into some slides a little later on that, and we can get into discussions about that in more detail. But certainly there's some expectations or some concern that turnover is going to continue as a result of just a different mindset amongst millennials.
Can I stop you there, Jeff?
Yeah,
we've got a question from Yen Tran. Yen, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi, thank you, Ian. If you could go back to the previous slide, showing the level of female, executive level. Just wondering if you were able to, connect this with the link, of the age from the 40 to the 49, that group dropped, about 7%. Were you able to tell that, if that's the group, and then got to do with this level? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I haven't done the math to see where the combination of the two is. It's there and available, I'm sure, in the study data, but I haven't done that math, so I won't pretend I have. But I think when it comes to, well, I mean, let's take a look at some of the more recent. There's been some retirements of some very prominent women leaders in this industry, and several of them have not been replaced by female leaders. So what does that tell you about again, one-offs? It's hard to say, but if that continues over multiple leadership transitions, what does that mean in terms of do we have the right next level down, being trained and mentored and developed to get to those levels? So I think there is some challenges there for sure.
So Jeff, retention is obviously a big issue for companies right now, keeping employees happy. And you talk to a lot of people that are looking to change jobs, and you're the conduit. So what are you hearing from people? What are the reasons for wanting to leave an organization? What's causing that?
Yeah, look, I do have some slides that I'll talk about in a bit, but why don't I quickly hit some highlights. I mean, why people leave is so personal and so specific to individuals. But are there themes? I think that there are. I think that I'm seeing amongst some of the younger people today, the millennials, if you will. Often one of the first things I'm telling you is it's about career pathing. It's about opportunities. It's about wanting to lead people, and not getting those opportunities where they are. I'm certainly hearing that on a periodic basis. I'm hearing, a little bit around, am I close enough to the business? Am I adding value? Am I, do I feel like I'm impacting the business? And if I'm not, I want to find a role where that can happen. And some of it's just like, I'm not, I hear it certainly in the broker world. My company just doesn't have the right resources for me to be successful. They've lost markets, and I can't sell the way I used to be able to sell. I've got to find somewhere that's got those capabilities and where I can do more business and do what I'm used to being able to do. So certainly a little different than perhaps in the past, when compensation would have been one of the first things that I heard. Or challenges with bosses are still relevant. Let's face it. If your boss and you just don't have the same view of the world, that's going to have a reason why you're going to want to make a move. So some of the reasons are still what they always have been, and some are a little bit new.
And Jeff, probably with COVID hitting like it did, you're saying that everyone's going to be locked in for the next little while. You think there's probably less likelihood people jumping jobs in this climate? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think that is there a little bit of put my head down because I don't want to risk anything in this kind of environment. There's probably some of that. But people who are good people who are talented and are looking for the next thing are not going to let something like this worry them. They've got confidence in their abilities and they're not they're not concerned about taking some risk and making a move in this kind of environment. It's still happening and on a regular basis right now. Moves are happening, transitions are happening, and so yeah. I mean, I think it's probably a little more hesitant, but not gone away for sure. All right, maybe we'll keep going. I'm sure we'll get some more questions as we go. So where were we? Talked about turnover. This was, I was telling you that, put some things up on millennial. We could do an entire session on sort of multi-generations in the workforce. I mean, we've talked about the fact, I'm sure you've heard about the fact that this is the first time in history that there's 5 generational cohorts all working at the same time. You've got your boomers, your Gen X, your millennials, you've got Gen Zers coming in at the bottom, and you've got what they call traditionalists. Not sure I love that name, but those over 70 are still in the marketplace, right? So you actually have 5 cohorts in the market all at the same time. These are obviously the bulk of them are these 3. But there's been a major flip, right? 2007, millennials were 12%. Now they're almost 40%. Boomers were 50%. They're down to 27% as they sort of retire and out of the industry. Gen X's are pretty much holding their ground in the middle at about a third. And so that does everybody. You can argue all you want about. Are people or their differences in how people think. There's a reason why there's categorizations around boomers, millennials, Gen X. There's reasons they capture those in particular blocks the way they do is because there is differences and generally the way they think. There's still so much that's individual though that I hate generalizing, but at the same time, if you don't, you're missing out on some real trends. So I think you have to look at what it means to manage a multi-generational workforce. To how are they going to learn from each other? How are they going to communicate with each other? How?
Yeah.
Sorry, I heard.
Yep. Sorry, Jeff.
Alistair, was that Alistair? I see a hand.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Jeff. I have another person queued up to ask a question. So can I have Alistair jump in here?
Yeah.
Alistair. No,
Hi, guys.
Thank you.
That's not me making that background, so there must be somebody else.
Could we ask everyone to please mute yourself? And I'm going down the list, just making sure mics are off here. So apologize for that, but yeah.
So I just wanted to pick up on that discussion around how does turnover and talent recruitment work in a COVID environment. I've just seen a dear friend of mine get a fantastic new senior executive role where she described, completing the agreement and joining this team and still hadn't actually physically met anybody in the company.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a whole new thing for. I'm not quite a traditionalist, but that's new to me.
Well,
I've also seen. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I've also seen the first evidence of terminations done remotely, and so that's also quite an extraordinary thing to imagine as the manager doing it or the person receiving the news. But where I wanted to go was, in a world where I'm eager to be recognized for my talents and I'm looking for opportunity, the world of industry networking would have been a critical part of how I would have done that before. And a lot of that is harder to do in a COVID world. So is that just being practical? Is that materially increasing your business proposition in terms of ability for folks to submit resumes so that who's in the market or could be in the market Is that the only way that people can make it clear they're available these days, or is there something else you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more challenging for people. I mean, a lot of times you would have at a cocktail party had a quiet, sort of thing saying, hey, what are you up to these days? I'd love to, hear more about your business or whatever. Now it becomes more about formally reaching out. And when you formally reach out, it becomes, a little more obvious around why you're doing it and what the implications are. And so, yeah, I do think that there's certainly some implications for that. And yes, I do, certainly get calls because people are like, look, I know you're still having these conversations. It's harder for me too. So, please keep an eye for me, that kind of thing. So yes, that is definitely happening. And going back to your first question around, are people still getting hired in this environment, remotely? The funny story, but I had somebody that I had placed as a second in command in finance and at a company in December, not starting until March. Had given a reasonable notice to their existing company. Started their first day, at home instead of in the office. Has still never once been in the office. Has never physically met a single one of the leadership team. Has fortunately had met some of their team before that in industry seminars and sessions, so knew their team personally, but not 100%, but knew a lot of them. And yet has already been promoted to head of the department, because the person who they reported to got a job after 7 online interviews, and is left to work at home. There, so it's still happening. And these are mainstream companies, so it is happening. I'm seeing right now, frankly, more companies realizing that this is going to go on for a while. A lot of them tried to hold off hiring in this way because it was uncomfortable and they weren't used to it. And what they're finding now is, their people are for various reasons, getting swamped, finding it harder to do their jobs, making do with less because you're not doing the hiring and you're just putting more pressure on people that already have challenges in being efficient and effective and things working from home and getting the right mentoring and doing all those things, and you're just overloading them with work. And so they're realizing we have to figure this out and make it happen no matter who we are. So yeah, I'm seeing that happen for sure.
Thanks.
Good, no problem. So I can answer questions on millennials later. I think enough of this is just to keep a mindset around that there are different generations working in this marketplace, and it does mean something in terms of talent and talent risk and how you manage and how you retain and train and etc. So let's take a look at risk and mitigation quickly, because we're getting near the end, and I do want to get to mitigation because I think it is critical. Because there's no point in me setting up all the risks for you and then walking away and saying there's no hope. There is hope. There are things that companies can do and the industry can do. When I talk to the industry execs around what are you seeing out in the industry that sort of pan industry programs, initiatives that are making any sort of headway on reducing talent risk. And there weren't, to be honest, as many as I expected people to mention, but they're out there. Certainly, great kudos were given to the ISC for a lot of the work they're doing, not only in the designation part of things, CIP, FCIP, CRM, and going online and doing all those things, but the workforce study themselves. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't measure it, it's not going to get reviewed and looked at and done. So just the fact that they do these studies and measure them, I think is everybody's recognizing is critical. The My Career, if you haven't seen that on the IC path around, career pathing for all sorts of jobs and explaining how, what there is in the industry. Rebo's got continuing education. There's college and university insurance programs that are expanding and bringing more people into the industry. In fact, there's discussions right now because basically all of those programs have 100% placement. You graduate from one of those college insurance programs, you're getting a job in insurance. So why aren't they doubling or tripling the volume? And discussions are obviously going on with those colleges and universities to ask those questions. Diversity initiatives, we're seeing things like Black North. There was quite a few, insurance companies and participating in that, more on the life side in terms of signing it, but in terms of contributing and those things and talking about it. I know there's been some PNC side as well. Insurance Supper Club to mentor women and leaders in the industry. resource hubs like the Leadership Learning Circle that I know Andrew Steen is heavily involved with, and a bunch of companies that are involved there and trying to mentor younger leaders to be able to take the next steps in their careers, and how they're doing that in frankly probably a more scalable way now than was possible in person. So I think you're actually going to see some of those things expand in this COVID world, which is actually positive, although not quite in the way that would have been in the past with sort of one-on-one or sort of direct interaction, but nevertheless opportunities to get coaching and mentoring from senior leaders in the industry that aren't necessarily at your own company. So there are things that are happening, and there are reasons when those things happen to be positive about the industry. The IIC report was not all about the sort of challenges; it was also about some of the opportunities. So the next slide quickly. For example, you will see that when it comes to job satisfaction in the industry, when you look at very and somewhat satisfied, probably a bigger share of somewhat than very, which is something that's got to change. But at the end of the day, there's not that many people dissatisfied, or even somewhat dissatisfied with their work. So it shows that once you get into this industry, people generally enjoy it. Now, job satisfaction is not the only factor. If you love your job but you're not good at it, then that doesn't help the companies and the industry as a whole. So you really look a little bit more, I think, at engagement, and that's the next slide. And employee engagement is also high in this industry. You'll see that on a lot of the key sort of critical questions that you ask around engagement, very successful 70+%, agree, somewhat agree, marks, which would be higher than you see in a lot of other sectors. Contribute to company success, proud to work here, and company inspires me. Those sorts of questions do, again, once you get people in this industry, they enjoy it, they're engaged, they do the work. So we need to be trumpeting that more to get people into this industry and engaged in this industry. It's not what's considered a sexy industry, is what I heard a lot from the CEOs, but it is in other places of the world, if not perhaps quite in those terms. At least it is a very well-respected sector where people covet jobs there, right? That's true in parts of Europe and Asia and other places. Probably not quite as true here, but no reason that can't happen, and no reason that COVID can't help do that, because we do have a pretty stable industry that's still making money, that isn't laying off tons of people. So perhaps there's some impacts of COVID associated with that as well. So when it comes to mitigation, there's some high level messages which I think are important. I think that overall companies, if they want to try to mitigate talent risk, need to look at a bunch of different areas. Needs to be around a tone from the top, right? You have to have the boards and the CEOs and the functional teams like risk and HR all sort of working in lockstep to recognize it as an area of focus that's needed, to sort of integrate talent risk into other things that they're doing, to talk about things that maybe perhaps a little bit more in a risk terminology than just an operational terminology when it comes to talent. Tends to be very, very operational. And that's I think there's opportunities to sort of push that a little bit more into the risk realm. Needs to be more of a holistic view of talent. Some companies do a great job of hiring, but then fall down on the onboarding or the training or the mentoring. Some people, have a tough time getting them in, but once they're in, they get trained really well and mentored well. But then there's no career path for them to go to. So they kind of, the turnover is still high because at some point they just cap out. I think you really need to look at the whole journey: hiring, onboarding, training, mentoring, career pathing, and retention, if you're going to be if you're going to be successful. Again, I'm really a proponent of employee engagement. Satisfaction is one thing, but I think employee engagement is critical. I think at the end of the day, engagement. Engaged employees are the ones that are motivated. They go the extra mile. One of the CEOs said they don't walk past the problem, and I love that sort of visual. They it might not be in their lane, but they see a problem, they're not going to just walk by it. They're going to figure it out. They have accountability and integrity, and they're so fundamental to risk management, is to have engaged teams. So I think you really need to look at that. Diversity, we've talked about, diversity implications in hiring, in retention, in training, all those things. You need to look at diversity holistically. And while I said comp is not necessarily as big an issue as it used to be in terms of number one thing that people talk about, if you don't have your comp right, you're still not going to make it work. I mean, you have to be able to. Your comp has to fit your business plan. I've had clients that I've had to have conversations with where they said we're a top 15% quartile employer. That's who we want to have in place. That's the kind of talent we want to attract. And they were top 50% compensation. I'm saying you're not going to get there. You've got to change one or the other because you can't have expectations that don't match what you're doing. And of course, comp is a very complicated process in itself. You've got issues around total comp. How do you split that up between base and all the incentives, et cetera? So whole other topic we can do on comp programs, but you do have to still get it right. I saw a hand flash up. I'm happy to, but then it disappeared. I'm not sure where. Okay, I'll assume we'll catch that at the end then if we didn't catch it. So and then there's at the individual pieces. So there's hiring. Again, if you have engaged staff and they're out there, they're the ones that are going after your hires. They're going to see that, and then you're going to get engaged hires out of engaged staff who are out there doing your recruiting and being the face of your company. We got to get to prospects earlier. You need to be able to attract them at the entry level and help people understand why this is a great industry. And we talked about that earlier. And it can be co-op programs or rotational programs and just more work on campus. And a lot of companies are starting to do that, and you're starting to see some traction there. Get more creative with experienced hires. I can talk about that in a little bit, but a lot of companies are starting to get more creative on bringing people into this industry that don't necessarily have industry experience, because we do have these big gaps in the barbell and in some experience levels. And how do we deal with that from an experienced hire without insurance experience, or perhaps without Canadian insurance experience, but they have it globally, that kind of thing. Again, effective onboarding, alternative sourcing. A lot of companies are having to look at, do people come back after post-retirement in different in different ways, and part-time work and outsourcing, offshoring, all sorts of different ways of looking at sourcing. I don't know how that shameless plug got there, so we'll just move on past that one. But next slide. I'm not going to go into my training matrix or the training matrix more. I'm just, that's a whole topic we could do on training, but, it is important to recognize that training means a lot of things, right? Training is a broad sort of, umbrella that really talks to, hard skill training, soft skill training, and some of what Alistair was talking about earlier, that sometimes you just need to understand the industry or the institutional knowledge and those sorts of things. How do you navigate through politics and, some of those things that are just, how I know, folks like Alistair and I grew up and sort of learned, cut our teeth in the industry. If I hadn't done that and understood how to navigate those things, I wouldn't have sort of done a lot of what I was able to do. Formal versus informal training, centralized and decentralized options, external and internal resources for making that happen. And I think just generally helping people understand just how much talent is in this industry. I did a search in my database and I found over 200 different designations on candidates that I have in this industry. There are, Bachelor of X, Masters of Y, CFAs, CA, CPAs, CHRP, CRMs, REBO, RPLU. There's just so many amazing designations alone that people can leverage and to great effect in this industry. And then there's a lot of informal things as well: coaching, mentoring, and lunch and learns, and town halls, and workshops, and all those things that are perhaps a little less formal than just getting a designation. So whole other topic on training, but you've got to make sure you can't do everything, right? So you have to balance the expense load with that, and you've got to apply the training in a way that's mitigating risk that's applicable in your particular company. So just some things to think about there. Next slide. And then we talked about before, it's just engagement and if you want engagement and retention, because it's great to keep people, but if you're keeping the wrong people or unengaged people, it's not going to help you. So how do you put in programs and make sure you're doing things that are retaining and engaging people? And I think we talked about this earlier, Ian. You got to give them interesting work. You got to give them some clarity around their career path. got to have a culture that works for them, and it's not going to work for everybody. You got to have a culture and then find the people that are going to fit well in that culture. There's physical and mental health. I mean, it's great to have people, but if they can't stay healthy and keep working and those things, and I think mental health especially is going to be a much more prominent thing to be looking at, with everything that's going on with COVID. I think that's going to be a big challenge for a lot of people. And that can be in sort of macro ways or micro ways.
I see another hand, Jeff, before we.
Yeah, please.
Please. I just want to get in under the wire here. So Tracy,
Tracy,
Mann, please.
Good, Jeff. Nice to see you. Thank you for the presentation. Just on the slide around engagement, just kind of wondering what you're hearing from the industry regarding engagement of their employees. Now they're working remotely. I know we've done our own employee engagement surveys, but I'm just wondering what you've seen in the industry.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of companies still trying to figure it out, to be honest. I do see a lot of, when it comes down to it, you've got to just have your managers and your leaders doing the right things and leading and managing, right? And so, are you reaching out, in various ways? And there's still town halls happening electronically. There's still, one-on-one meetings, team meetings every morning. You got, got industry functions still happening that the companies are, encouraging their people to attend, like the trivia night that we just did. Last night with, and those kind of things with the IC. There's still a lot of things you can do to keep your talent engaged, keep your talent, sane right now, to be honest, which is a challenge. It is a challenge. So yeah, there's a lot of things that are happening. It's very company specific though. Good. All right. I think I'll just flip through just quickly. So I'm not going to. Oh yeah, that was it. So we're at the end anyway. So that was good. Not as much time at the end for questions as I hope, but at the end of the day, we did get quite a few questions along the way. So I'm glad of that. Is there time for a few more? I'm happy to do it if you
absolutely. So throw it open if the one last call for questions. And Jeff, in the meantime, I can add one more to your list of my very first job is in the transportation industry, and ran into this business owner, very, very nice gentleman, retiring at the time, and he gave me his business card, and it had his name in capital KOOGS. And I said, wow, I've never come across this. What is this? And he said, kicked out of grade school. So said it with a straight face. That was a new one for me. So there's one for your list. Anyone else for a question out there before we thank Jeff for his presentation today? Okay, Jeff, I think you're off the hook. That was very informative, very practical, great ideas in terms of getting people engaged. And I will share your slide presentation with members. And you never know, you may hear from people in future. But really appreciate you being here today to help us tackle this subject.
My contact information. I'm happy to fill in any of the details. I know we didn't get a lot of time for questions, so if anybody has any questions on any of it, I'm happy to have a chat.
Jeff, I'll make sure I pass it on to members. So thanks very much. Let's take just a couple of minutes. Everyone, you can rise up for a couple of seconds while we change over slides and say goodbye to Jeff and welcome our panel. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes to get up the slides for our industry presentation on OSFI's seminar, risk management seminar this morning, and then we'll return back here. Okay, so just thanks again, Jeff, and everyone else hang tight for 2 minutes. We'll take a 2-minute break.